Okay, Thursday morning, Jeremiah chapter 50. Jeremiah chapter 50 starts a two-chapter um, prophecy, which is the final of the prophecies to the nations. We've had about six or seven nations. Some got full chapters, some got just a few verses. Some figure more prominently in history of the Israelites and the Jewish people, and others less so. We began with Egypt and we conclude with Babylonia. Babylonia, of course, and we'll see reference to this. Babylonia is the This is not our first, I'll say it this way, this is far from our first time talking about Babylonia uh, in in the book of Jeremiah. Just until now, Babylonia has been the anticipated aggressor against the Israelites, the one who is God's agent in carrying out the prophesied punishment of Judah and Jerusalem. It's going to come at the hands of the Babylonians being the people from the north, such that in chapter 1 of Jeremiah already, one of Jeremiah's first prophecies is Mitzafon tipatach hara'ah, the evil or the destruction upon Israel is going to come from the north, and that's a reference to Babylonia. Of course, it is the Babylonians that come and that lay siege to Jerusalem and that bring about the destruction and the exile starting back in 597 and going all the way to 586 BCE. But now the Babylonians are, part of this second section of Jeremiah in which we're going nation by nation and hearing what God has to say about each nation. And the general themes and trends that we've seen are that these are about the punishments that will come to these other nations. Sometimes we see their sins. Usually it's haughtiness, and over pridefulness, thinking that they are as powerful as God. We've seen uh, sometimes more poetry, sometimes a little bit of prose. We've seen wordplay, and we'll see a little bit of that in this chapter as well. We've continually looked out to see which nations at the end of, or at some point in their prophecy of the destruction, get a note of consolation that then they will be restored, and which ones don't get that. We'll keep an eye out for that about Babylonia. Um, these have been some of the kind of themes and concepts we've looked for. And we've also asked ourselves, how much are these kind of unique prophecies delivered by Jeremiah for this particular moment? And how much might they just incorporate, the material that was floating around in that time, or even from previous times, going back to the Chumash, going back to Isaiah? The prophetic material about the nations wasn't necessarily separate from prophet to prophet, but there was some body of texts or ideas or teachings about various nations that Jeremiah was drawing from, not necessarily getting a fully new message from God at that time. Chapter 50 is a long one, and chapter 51 is even longer. So as we did for the longer ones, we'll read through and make a few comments, just try to get an overall feel for it and point out a few things, but we won't necessarily delve into every detail of the chapter as we cover it this week. I'll just start off before we read through the chapter, making one more point and then one short reading. I neglected to mention one of the other themes we've looked for in the prophecies about the nations is how much are they seem to be segregated from Israel. In other words, it's literally a prophecy that the prophet is delivering about Edom or Moab without any reference to the Israelites, as though we are not a part of the story, and Jeremiah is turning his face away from Israel towards these other nations and speaking to them or about them without respect to their relationship with Israel at all. And when is there, interspersed throughout some reference about the connection of Israel to the nation that's being prophesied about? And in this one, I would say we have far and away the most references to the Jewish people, to the Israelites in the context of this. In fact, one could argue that really the Babylonian prophecy here is much more explicitly a prophecy to and about Israel, and that Babylonia is just kind of the stage for this prophecy. So we'll notice that, and we've also seen a lot of nature, language, and metaphors, waters and other things like that, agriculture, and here sheep is our key nature metaphor. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Here's what the JPS Jewish Study Bible offers by way of introduction to these two chapters, the first of which, chapter 50, we're going to be looking at in a moment. Jeremiah's oracle concerning Babylonia. Although Jeremiah consistently maintained that Judah must submit to Babylonia, he is hardly sympathetic to the Babylonians, right? Remember, what's Jeremiah's posture towards Babylonia as he speaks to Judah and Jerusalem over the previous chapters? He's always telling them, don't try to defeat the Babylonians. The best thing to do is submit. And that always puts him at odds with some of the kings who want to fight. And he's telling them, no, just submit. Even though he says that Judah must submit to Babylonia, he is hardly sympathetic to the Babylonians. Babylonian brutality is the destruction of Jerusalem. Babylonian brutality in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, as well as the deportation of a major element of Judah's population, would have prompted the prophet's condemnation, right? So even though on the one hand, he's always telling the Israelites, don't try to fight Babylonia, but he still has no love lost for Babylonia. They have been the vehicle of the destruction and exile of his people, or near destruction and exile of his people. His views are much like that of Isaiah, who first argued that Assyria was the divinely appointed agent of Israel's punishment, and then condemned the Assyrians for overstepping their bounds with their cruelty to Israel and blasphemy against God. Meaning it's one thing to follow God's charge to, punish the Israelites, but, then there's doing it in a way which warrants your own punishment as well. This oracle, or more likely collection of oracles, is reserved for last, right? We noticed that this is the final of the prophecies about the nations, as a climax of the collection of oracles against the nations. Much of these two chapters emphasizes that Babylonia will be destroyed through violence. In reality, however, and can't remember, one of us sometimes raises this question, wait a minute, did the prophecy really come true as it was described, and what does it mean if it doesn't? So much of these two chapters emphasizes that Babylonia will be destroyed through violence. In reality, however, Cyrus bloodlessly took over Babylon in 539 BCE, when the powerful priests of Marduk preferred him to the reigning Babylonian king Nabunaid. So it's interesting that the prophecies we're going to read are about a bloody destruction of Babylonia. Maybe it's Lance who sometimes makes this point, right? About a bloody destruction of Babylonia. But what actually happens to Babylonia subsequent to their destruction or, exiling of the Israelites? They get taken over, but without all the blood and death that the prophet describes. So does that mean that we're supposed to apply this message of Jeremiah to a different, later time, or that it simply was somehow a prophecy that didn't come true as prophesied? These are, as always, bigger questions than what we can necessarily answer. And with that said, let's open up Jeremiah chapter 50. If you have a brown JPS Tanach with you, we are on page 1137 in the middle, and I'm partway through the chapter, so let's pull it back up to chapter 50, verse 1, and we'll turn to Ruby. Would you start us off? The word which the Lord spoke.
The word which the Lord spoke concerning Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans, to the prophet Jeremiah. Declare among the nations and proclaim. Raise a standard, proclaim. Hide nothing, say, Babylon is captured, Bel ashamed, Merodach is dismayed. Her idols are shamed, her fetish is dismayed. For a nation from the north has attacked her. It will make her land a desolation. No one shall dwell in it. Both man and beast shall wander away. In those days and at that time, declares the Lord, the people of Israel together with the people of Judah shall come, and they shall weep as they go to seek the Lord their God. They shall inquire for Zion. In that direction their faces shall turn. They shall come and attach themselves to the Lord by a covenant for all time, which shall never be forgotten. My people were lost sheep. Their shepherds led them astray. They drove them out of the mountains. They roamed from mountain to hill. They forgot their own resting place. All who encountered them devoured them, and their foes said, we shall not be guilty because they have sinned against the Lord, the true pasture, the hope of their fathers, the Lord. Flee from Babylon, leave the land of the Chaldeans, and be like he-goats that leave the flock. For see, I am rousing and leading an assemblage of great nations against Babylon. From the lands of the north they shall draw up their lines against her. There she shall be captured. Their arrows are like those of a skilled warrior who does not turn back without hitting the mark. Chaldea shall be despoiled. All her spoilers shall be sated, declares the Lord. For you rejoiced, you exulted, you who plundered my possession. You stamped like a heifer treading grain. You neighed like steeds. So your mother will be utterly shamed. She who bore you will be disgraced. Behold the end of the nations, wilderness, desert, and steep. Because of the Lord's wrath, she shall not be inhabited. She shall be utterly desolate. Whoever passes by at Babylon will be appalled and will hiss at all her wounds. Range yourselves around about Babylon, all of you who draw the bow. Shoot at her, don't spare arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Raise a shout against her all about. She has surrendered. Her bastions have fallen, her walls are thrown down. This is the Lord's vengeance. Take vengeance on her. Do to her as she has done. Make an end in Babylon of sowers and of wielders of the sickle at harvest time. Because of the deadly sword, each man shall turn back to his people. They shall flee everyone to his land. Israel is scattered sheep, harried by lions. First the king of Assyria devoured them, and then King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon crunched their bones. Assuredly, thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I will deal with the king of Babylon and his land as I dealt with the king of Assyria. And I will lead Israel back to his pasture, and he shall graze in Carmel and Bashan and eat his fill in the hill country of Ephraim and in Gilead.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ruby. Estelle, do you want to take over verse 20? In those days and at that time.
In those days and at that time, declares the Lord, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought, and there shall be none. The sins of Judah, and none shall be found, for I will pardon those I allow to survive. Advance against her, the land of Merathaim, and against the inhabitants of Pekod. Ruin and destroy after them to the last, says the Lord. Do just as I have commanded you. Hark, war in the land and vast destruction. How the hammer of the whole earth has been hacked and shattered. How Babylon has become an appallment among the nations. I set a snare for you, O Babylon, and you were trapped unawares. You were found and caught because you challenged the Lord. The Lord has opened his armory and brought out the weapons of his wrath. For what is the task of my Lord God of hosts in the land of the Chaldeans? Come against her from every quarter, break open her granaries, pile her up like heaps of grain, and destroy her. Let her have no remnant. Destroy all her bulls. Let them go down to slaughter. Alas for them, their day is come, the hour of their doom. Hark, fugitives are escaping from the land of Babylon, to tell in Zion of the vengeance of the Lord our God, vengeance for his temple. Summon archers against Babylon, all who draw the bow, and camp against her round about. Let none of her people escape. Pay her back for her actions. Do to her just what she has done, for she has acted insolently against the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Assuredly, her young men shall fall in her squares, and all her warriors shall perish in that day, declares the Lord. I'm going to deal with you, O insolence, declares the Lord God of hosts, for your day is come, the time when I doom you. Insolence shall stumble and fall, with none to raise her up. I will set her cities on fire, and it shall consume everything around her.
Okay, good. Graham, will you do the last part, starting with verse 33?
Think we can carry on to Hamas that way? Sorry.
See if you can unmute, Graham. Yep.
Okay. Now I got something blocking. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the people of Israel are oppressed, and so too the people of Judah. All their captors held them, they refused to let them go. Their Redeemer is mighty. His name is Lord of hosts. He will champion their cause, so as to give rest to the earth and unrest to the inhabitants of Babylon. A sword against the Chaldeans, declared the Lord, and against the inhabitants of Babylon, against its officials and its wise men. A sword against the diviners, that they be made fools of. A sword against the warriors, that they may be dismayed. A sword against its horses and chariots, and against all the motley crowd in its midst, that they may become like women. A sword against its treasuries, that they may be pillaged. A drought against its waters, that they may be dried up. For it is a land of idols. They are besotted by their dread images. Assuredly, wild cats and hyenas shall dwell there, and ostriches shall dwell there. It shall never be settled again, nor inhabited throughout the ages. It shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbors, declares the Lord. No man shall live there, no human shall sojourn there. Lo, the people comes from the northland. A great nation and many kings are roused from the remotest parts of the earth. They grasp the bow and javelin. They are cruel. They show no mercy. The sound of them is like the roaring sea. They ride upon horses, accoutred like a man for battle. Against you, O fair Babylon. The king of Babylon has heard the report of them, and his hands are weakened. Anguish seizes him, pangs like a woman in childbirth. It shall be as when a lion comes out of the jungle of the Jordan against a secure pasture. In a moment, I can harry them out of it and appoint over it anyone I choose. Then who is like me? Who can summon me? Who is the shepherd who can stand up against me? Hear then the plan that the Lord has devised against Babylon and has purposed against the land of Chaldea. Surely the shepherd boys shall drag them away. Surely the pastors shall be aghast because of them. At the sound of Babylon's capture, the earth quakes, and an outcry is heard among the nations.
Okay.
Wow.
So, very rich imagery. As we heard probably 3 or 4 references throughout the 45, 46 verses to this shepherd imagery. And another theme that I think comes out very strongly is this theme of vengeance or measure for measure. Just as they destroyed or harmed Israel, so will they be harmed. And it seems also the punishment for again, as we referenced, the way Isaiah critiques and prophesies the punishment of Assyria, it's one thing if you were just a faithful servant, God told you Babylonia to destroy or take up arms against the Israelites and exile them from their land, and you did so, but that wasn't enough. You did it, and this, of course, hard not to hear the contemporary echoes. You did it with celebration. You rejoiced and you mocked them, and you took pride in being able to destroy, as opposed to simply doing the duty that I charged you to do as my agent. But you took pleasure in the destruction, and that is part of what warrants now your comeuppance, and that's going to come, not just from one nation, although it's primarily seems to be Persia and slash Media that's doing it, but that there's going to be the mustering of, kings and countries from around the land that will come to, to the destruction of Babylonia. So we see some of these ideas throughout. And of course, as we mentioned as well, from nearly the get-go, Israel is mentioned, that this, the downfall of Babylonia is kind of creates a pathway for the restoration of Israel. This wouldn't be a relevant aspect of some of the other prophecies against the nations, because some of the other nations may have, skirmished or battled with Israel at one point, but they weren't the force that exiled Israel. So their destruction or downfall doesn't have an immediate implication for Judah and Jerusalem. But because Babylonia is the proximate oppressor and exiler of Israel, so in describing the downfall of Babylonia, we also necessarily include and circle back to the restoration of Israel. So let me make just a few specific points in the chapter, and then we'll open it up a little bit more. So again, we also have references here to the gods of the Babylonians, Bel, Merodach, that they are shamed. And of course, there's an implicit criticism of idolatry here, even though these are the gods of the other nations, but the sense of their impotence is kind of lifted up. Again, a nation from the north has attacked her. We have that from the very beginning in verse 3. And then close to the end, we see it again in verse 41. A people comes from the northland. And this is, as I mentioned, harkens us back to one of the first prophecies in Jeremiah chapter 1, where he sees a pot bubbling over. And let's find that spot. A steaming pot tipped away from the north. And God says, from the north shall disaster break loose. So we also have this, the measure for measure plays out here in that Babylonia was the first prophecy of Jeremiah, was Babylonia. It's really his second. The first one is the almond branch, timely for Tu B'Shvat. But the second inauguration training prophecy is the pot tipping over from the north, which is the destruction that's going to come to Israel from Babylonia in the north. And then the book, we're near the end. Again, we'll just have a little historical recap after chapter 51, but really the last prophecy about nations, the last prophecy in Jeremiah, here in chapter 50 and 51, includes this mention that the people from the north who come to exile Israel will themselves now be overtaken by a people from the north. The Jewish Study Bible, the JPS Jewish Study Bible, points out that this doesn't seem exactly accurate in that Persia/Media is a little bit more east than north. So maybe it's just the poetic license to point out this kind of measure for measure, that it was the people from the north who exiled Israel, and now they're going to be punished by people from the north, even though it's not precisely north. And then, hold on a second. Okay, and then in verse 4, we're told at that time, right, what's going to be the consequence of the destruction of Babylonia? Then the people of Israel and the people of Judah will come back together. And now notice this language, B'nai Yisrael u'v'nai Yehuda yachdav, the people of Israel together with the people of Judah. Because now with the fall of Babylonia, the vision is, and again, we asked this question, did this really come to fruition? But the vision is that the exiled northern kingdom from, 150 years earlier will also be restored together with the more recent exiles of Judah and Jerusalem. And I think I saw maybe Lance pop this into the chat. Yes, this was 137. Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit later. But I'm thinking about, I think it's 126 that we say, Shir Hamalot B'Shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion. Hold on 1 second. I'll be right back. Just have to help someone with something. Give me a moment. Yes. So in this verse 4, where we talk about the restoration of the captives of Zion, we're told, Haloch uvacho yelechu. They will weep as they go. And of course, this evokes the end of that psalm, Haloch yelech uvacho, the same idea of weeping as they go. And here the language is weeping as they go, Ve'et Hashem Eloheihem yivakeshu. they go to seek the Lord their God. So they're, going to be restored and also kind of not just come back to their land, but come back to their God. And we have this beautiful language, Tzion Yish'alu, right? We have that, beautiful liturgical poem, Tzion Halo Tishali, of, I believe, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that we read as a Kina on Tisha B'Av. And here it's Tzion Yishalu. They should inquire about Zion and turn their faces in that direction, come and attach themselves to the Lord by a covenant for all time. So the first, we have a brief mention of the downfall of Babylonia and extensive mention of the restoration of Israel. Now we go through a little sheep metaphor here. My people were lost sheep, or I guess this is a simile. My people were lost sheep. Tzon ovdot hayu ami. The shepherds led them astray. So we have this sense, and this accords with other passages in Jeremiah. Even just for a moment, we shift over to this one, I believe. Yep. Earlier on in the book, Jeremiah chapter 23 begins, shepherds who let the flock of my pasture stray and scatter. God says concerning the shepherds, you let my flock scatter and go astray, and I myself will gather the remnant of my flock and appoint new shepherds. So we have this, internal metaphor in Jeremiah 23 about the people as lost sheep with, poor leadership, and we have that here too. Their shepherds led them astray. So this image returns again. And extends the kind of expansion of the sheep shepherd extends all the way to God, who's here called Nivei Tzedek, the true pasture. So we have God folded into this, array of metaphors or similes as well. Continues on here, and then we circle back to, leave aside the returning exiles of Judah at the downfall of Babylonia and come back to more language of the Babylonian destruction. And here again, we see part of why that destruction is so severe, or prophesied to be so severe, is this verse, because you rejoiced, you exulted, plundered my possessions, stamped like a heifer, neigh like steeds, all these ways, not just of carrying out the destruction, but of enjoying it, leads to the downfall of Babylonia. And so you will be shamed. And now we have some of this kind of usual language of destruction. It will be desolate. Others will kind of mock it as they walk by. And the invitation now to others to join in the destruction of Babylon, for she has sinned against the Lord. Again, is that just because we've touched on this question before? Is Babylonia just being punished because it carried out what God said, and after you attempt to exile and harm the Judeans, you just have to be punished, even though you were doing what God told you to do to begin with? Or, is the sin against the Lord the mere fact of actually carrying out God's command? Or is it, as it seems, about the way it was done and the kind of celebration of it, as opposed to just doing it? And then we come back to this language of God's vengeance, a little bit of kind of the destruction of agriculture, and again, coming back to Israel as scattered sheep. And now we sort of expand out and say, it's not just the Babylonians, but we've been scattered sheep since the time of the king of Assyria. This again relating to the northern kingdom of Israel, not just the Judeans. So this is a kind of a broader scope prophecy. And so God says, just like I did with Assyria, I will do with Babylonia, lead Israel back. So again, we have section of destruction of Babylonia, restoration of Israel, another section of destruction of Babylonia, another section of restoration of Israel. And in those days and at that time, we will see that there is the Israelites don't have a sin to be held accountable for, and those who remain will be restored. The JPS Bible commentary notes in verse 21 a little wordplay. Advance against her, the land of Merataim, and against the inhabitants of Pekod. These are presumably place names in Babylonia, but they're also puns. Merataim means double rebellion, and Pekod means punishment, being visited punishment. So we use these place names that are also puns for the wrongful behavior of Babylonia and their punishment. And we hear more about the destruction of the land which is coming, the invitation again to others to participate, the imagery of Babylonia itself as like, agricultural yield, which is now being kind of destroyed and scattered about, and even to the point of saying that, fugitives are going to escape to Israel to sort of talk about maybe they're going there to seek refuge, and there they're also reporting on the destruction in Babylonia. And then we get the description of the name of Babylonia as Zadon in verses 31 and 32. They're literally named insolent, arrogant, willful, wanton sinners. It becomes this sort of substitute name for Babylonia. And come back again to more language of the destruction. We have this little brief kind of alliteration or repetitive structure where every verse begins with, or every phrase begins with cherev, a sword, starting in verse 35. God is going to bring a sword, cherev, against the Chaldeans. Cherev al Kasdim, inhabitants, officials, wise men. Cherev el Habadim, a sword against the diviners. Cherev el Giboreha. And then we keep going. Cherev el Susav, Cherev el Otzroteha. And then we switch the punctuation and we say Chorev el Meimeha v'yaveshu. Little play after sword, 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 sword. Then we have Chorev, dry land or drought. So we just change the vowels a little bit to extend the alliteration of destruction, the sword, and then a drought for these idolatrous people. And then we come to this question we've looked at in different chapters. Will there then be a restoration after the destruction of the other nations? So here we get the indication that there won't be. Lo teshev od lanetzach, velo tishkon adol vadol. It will never be settled again, not inhabited throughout the ages again. This doesn't seem to have come true yet. It'll be like Sodom and Amorah. No man will live there. No human will sojourn there. Then we come back again to describe the vision from the north. One more little reference to the sheep and pasture, and then conclude. So these core themes of what you did to Israel will be done to you. That the destruction of Babylonia is followed by the restoration of Israel. The themes of a sheep and shepherd, I would say, are the core aspects of the chapter. Thoughts and comments and reactions? Estelle, start us off.
I just have a question. I'm getting the time frame wrong. Is this after the Jews have been living in Babylon for a long time?
Yes, presumably it's at the end of the 70-year or towards the end of the 70-year exile. They're exiled in 597 and some in 586. And this is, again, the best destruction of Babylonia, historical moment in that vicinity is when the Persians, Medians, displaced the Babylonians, I think around 539 BCE. So after something like, 50 years of exile.
Yeah, but this is when the Jews were culturally doing very well in Babylon.
They still want to go home.
I'm finding the connection rather difficult.
Right. Well, I guess we could say maybe not everybody wanted to go home, but they couldn't go home while Babylonia was, ascendant and ruling them. So the downfall of Babylonia opens up the opportunity for them to go home. So we can say it that way. Lane?
Yeah, it came up when we were studying Daniel that the person who wrote Jeremiah, maybe he lived in a later time and knew what happened. Is that a possibility here?
Yes, it is a possibility. Although again, it leaves this sort of troubling question of why write about this bloody destruction and left with perpetual desolation when that doesn't seem to have been what happened. So maybe it could be a person who lived later, reflecting in part on what has happened in the past and attempting to prophesy something that would come later on in the future. It's hard to say, but yeah, it could be a later a later author reflecting.
That makes sense.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Who else wanted to comment? Graham, please.
Yeah, just a couple of things that okay, here the Lord expresses that he is especially offended by any kind of insolence.
Yes.
And so this is I mean, it's not an outright crime, but it seems to be taken a crime of attitude, like an attitude crime, insolence,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's not like I killed your dog or so I killed, I stole your money, that would be a crime. But the insolence is like a strange sort of psychological, an attitude breach, you know, of respect, where respect becomes, the lack of respect becomes a crime. So what is insolence? I looked it up. The quality of being insolent, pride or haughtiness manifested in contemptuous and overbearing treatment of others. Overbearing, high-handed, you're nothing. Like uh, assumption of superiority, arrogant contempt, brutal impudence.
Mm-hmm.
That would be impudence and insolence followed by brutality, which I guess says, because I am superior, I get to be brutal to you, that kind of thing. So anyway, the lesson for me is to be sensitive to insolence by this definition, and wherever I feel it and wherever I sense it. And also, I thought the second thing is that it is ironic to me that God's justification for punishing Babylon is the Hammurabi Code, which is basically an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And I guess if you carry it on, it's like insolence for an insolence.
Mm-hmm.
Like you be insolent to me, I'll be insolent to you, like that. And the date on that is the Hammurabi Code was 1750 BC. And what is the date on this book of Jeremiah?
Yes, this is, I mean, describing events that are happening in around, 500, and right now we're probably around 586 BCE. So,
Okay, so the Hammurabi Code was well established by that point, right?
yes, although we have these concepts in the Torah itself, eye for an eye, appears in the Torah, and the notion of kind of some type of retributive vengeance, even as a divine quality, appears in the Torah too. So we don't have to not resort in
Yeah,
a negative way, but we don't have to
interesting.
look beyond our own textual tradition for these concepts.
Right. Evidently, according to I looked it up, and it originated in Babylon, the Hammurabi Code, as a form of justice and government in general. So anyway, that was just maybe, I don't know
But
how that all fits together, but
Yeah.
is God's vengeance against all of Babylon, or exempting the Jews, or does it include everybody?
Right, right. I mean, it certainly seems to be against the people of Babylon as opposed to anyone residing within the political boundaries of Babylon. It seems to be about the Babylonians, not
Only,
about.
not the Jews.
Correct, correct, correct.
But the Jews were, it just makes no sense. I mean, he completely destroys all of Babylon. Maybe the Jews were guilty, maybe they weren't. I mean, you can't exempt them.
They already got their punishments. They had their round of punishment. That's why I think Jeremiah goes back to say, at that time, it's actually worth looking at that verse again for a moment because I think it speaks directly to what you're talking about. Hold on. Okay, so after I'll deal with the king of Babylon and his land as I dealt with the king of Assyria. I will lead Israel back to his pasture. He shall graze in Carmel and Bashan and eat his fill in the hill country of Ephraim and in Gilad. This is clearly indicative of the return of the northern, not just the Judeans. In those days and at that time, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought, and there shall be none. The sins of Judah, and none shall be found, for I will pardon those I allow to survive. That seems to mean the Israelites had already received their punishment for their wrongdoings, and they were, in a sense,
And now they're being pardoned.
protected as God carried out punishment against the Babylonians.
And then when Persia takes over Babylon, and the Israelites don't go back to Judea, are they punished again?
Hmm,
You know,
good question. Yeah, not sure. Not sure. Just noting some of Lance's comments in the chat, and then if Lance wants to say something himself, please feel free. First, pointing out Psalm 137 about the destruction, on a very, very similar theme, about the destruction of Babylon for what it did to Israel, and kind of comparing these two. Very instructive exercise. And then Lance, you wrote, if Hamakom means God's place, does Shir Hamalot mean God's song? It's an interesting question. We typically Ma'alot there seems to be translated as steps or ascents. I've never seen it directly connected to God, but an interesting possibility. And then thank you for pointing out the story of Choni and the 70-year period, and importance of looking ahead to the future, even if you won't be there, and more on Hammurabi's code. Do you want to add anything else, Lance?
I just want to say that I derive these comments from one, tangential thinking, and two, AI overview in Chrome, which enables me to do research extremely quickly, and also to allow my creative thinking, thinking out of the box, so to speak, putting together two, sometimes more, very different ideas, and hopefully coming up with something. Now, I said Shir Hamalot by meaning ascent, and ascent would equal God.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen that concept, but as creative tangential thinking, I think it qualifies as a creative reading without a doubt.
And I just want to congratulate Graham because he's right on target.
Great,
he
excellent.
usually is.
Thanks. But I have one more thing.
Yeah, Graham, back to you.
The fallacy of the Hammurabi Code is that if you answer a crime with a crime, you have twice as much crime as before. You know, so if you answer insolence with insolence, you end up with twice as much insolence.
What are you supposed to do? Back off?
No, but use call Lance and have Lance think of a creative solution.
Lance would suggest reading Measure for Measure by William Shakespeare, which exactly lines up to what you've just said, Graham.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Anyway.
Right, any last thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, we're halfway through this 2-chapter unit. Next week we should be on as usual for chapter 51, a very long one, and then we'll have just a few closing chapters of historical recap of the end of this period, and then I'll be here with cookies on whatever week we finish Jeremiah, and you're welcome to join me in person.
What is after
All
Jeremiah?
right.
Back at home. After Jeremiah is Ezekiel.
There you
Is
go.
that good?
That's great. It is fantastic.
And maybe cookies are the answer to the Hammurabi Code. Just
cookie for a cookie.
Cookies. Yeah.
Great. All right. Wonderful rest of the day, all, and hang in there.
It was a pleasure.
On. Love to man.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.